So hello, good afternoon. Oh no, I know good morgon, but I don't know good afternoon. So just pretend I said all that in Swedish. I'm going to be like, yeah, the ugly American who doesn't speak the local language. I'm Julie Lerman, and I am here to talk about serverless data APIs, although with my focus is going to be on using Azure Functions. I don't know how the concepts all the technical details of how this works relates to AWS or Google Cloud, how those work, but you can see how Azure Functions work. And I love using Azure Functions, and so I'm going to be showing you, I'd love to show you everything, but I can't. So I'm going to show you some of the things that really get me excited in Azure Functions, and also using Visual Studio Code and the extensions, which are so awesome. So that's me. We don't have time for that stuff. So here is the big secret about serverless computing. There is a server. It's just not your server. It's up in the cloud. So I mean, I guess everybody likes to make this joke now, like serverless. I don't know why they call it that. But it is a server that somebody else manages. And the beauty of that is not just the server management, but actually the infrastructure. A lot of these things that we normally have to deal with, especially when we've got our own servers and we have to deploy applications and everything, all that infrastructure goes away. And we get to just think about code, right? Just really about our code. So we here, these are just different ways people refer to these kinds of these serverless functions, whether the different names like Lambda functions on AWS. So I've heard functions serverless compute, right? But really, it's about abstracting away the implementation details, because I am no DevOps person. Like, I do not know how to do that kind of stuff. I'm always happy to have really smart people around me who know how to deal with that. I just want to code. I want to write the code and deal with my logic, right? So that's what the idea of serverless computing lets you do. So yeah, there are more than these three, but these are the big players, right? Azure Functions on Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Functions, and AWS Lambda. But again, my knowledge is around Azure. So I'm going to be focusing on Azure, Azure Portal, Azure Functions, but I'll also use Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to go from the portal to code. And one of the reasons I like to start with a portal, that's how I learned. That's how I really got my head around what Azure Functions were, what serverless was, how these things went together, because it gives you, it's like a puzzle, and it shows you. And once I got my head around it, then I was able to, stop working in the portal and just work in Visual Studio Code and debug and just focus on code. But a lot of people are adverse to learning programming, like by clicking buttons and stuff. But sometimes when concepts are a little hard to grasp, simplifying some of these external things really makes it easier to just find your path into comprehending it. And I do a lot of that. Like I mean, I've been programming for a long time, but I still get confused by a lot of things. So when I find a path that helps me get to my aha moment, I like to share that path so other people can hopefully get there as well. So the functions are really made up of the infrastructure, right? Not the functions. This whole serverless, the infrastructure is taken care of for you, but there are some minor configurations that you'll need to make. So, but little configurations, and they're done in JSON, right? Dealing with the infrastructure really is just a matter of some configuring, right? You don't have to write all this code in order to also implement the infrastructure. Then you do your coding. This is where your business logic is going, right? Right in your code. And that's the real effort that you're going to be making. And that's the part that we like to do. Well, I mean, there might be people here who love doing the DevOps stuff. I'm just saying I like to code because I'm not good at the DevOps stuff. So I like the business logic. I like thinking through those things. There's also external APIs involved. And the nice thing with Azure Functions is, again, to interact with those, it's just some configuration, right? So I got some configuration on the ends, but I get to do all of my real thinking and effort in writing the code. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you the basics in the portal, and then I'm going to flip over to Visual Studio Code, so we're no longer using the Azure portal, and we're actually just using an IDE, the way we like to code. You can also do this in Visual Studio 2017 on if you're on Windows. I just happen to like VS Code, so I use the extensions for that. So we'll just kind of go in that path. Before I do that, I want to make sure you understand the structure of an Azure Function app. So an app is actually a collection of functions. So the function app itself has its own application settings, and those are things, and I'll show you what those look like. But those settings are shared by those are common and shared by every function within the app. Then you have the functions themselves, right? So you might have a number of different functions. All right, so there's an app, it's a collection of functions, and then the functions. And the functions also have their own individual settings, right, that aren't shared between the others. So here's where we get the difference between what we're configuring and also what we're coding, as well as just understand, again, the workflow of Azure Functions. We do all the things that are configured are bindings, right? We have 3 different types of bindings. One is the binding that represents what triggers this function to activate. And it could be any number of things. It could be an HTTP request. It could be something happening in a message queue. It could be something happening in a Cosmos DB database. So you can't invent what the triggers are, right? There's a pre-existing set of those, and that set is expanding, right? But it's more than the ones I just listed. So what is it that's making this function start doing its job? Then there's input bindings. Its friend is way over here. That's why I have to keep going like that. Then there's input bindings. Again, this is just set up by configurations. You're not coding. It's just really simple. But what input bindings are is for additional information that your function might need. So your function might be triggered by an HTTP request, but you might need your function to, for example, use some data from a database, right? In my case, I'm using Azure Cosmos DB, which is the NoSQL database in Azure, right? So those are 2 very different things, and I could have a trigger that's also happening from Cosmos DB, right? So the trigger is the activation, the input's the input binding, and it sometimes seems I was confused at first because there's input coming in through the trigger as well. That's why it was hard for me at first to understand that. So the input bindings are to configure additional data sources for your function. Then you have the code that represents your function, right? That's the meat of everything. So that's not configuration, that's code, right? That could be C# or JavaScript. I'm doing Node.js. I'm using Node because I'm such an expert JavaScript developer. Could you see that I was being sarcastic there? But I like doing that, right? Because it pushes me to learn new things. So it's a lot of fun. And then there's one more binding, which is the output binding. So what happens at the end when all your code has worked? So here, an example of an output binding is you might send a response to, if you had requests coming in, HTTP requests coming in, you might send a response back to whatever requested. I have examples I'll be showing you where the output, what I'm pushing out, is I'm pushing data out to Cosmos DB database. There's another one, we're going to have a little fun. I'm going to push some data out through an SMS API that's going to send text to anybody who trusts me and will give me their cell phone numbers. This demo's getting harder to do now as I travel because of GDPR, but if you trust me, Maybe we'll do that. So there are different kinds of output bindings you can use. So the bindings are all just configuration, right? So if I'm doing an output binding where I'm spitting something out to Cosmos DB, I don't have to write all the connection strings and all of the code to say, put this into the database, save it, do this, do that. The binding takes care of it. I just say, here's some JSON, and then send it to the output binding. And the output binding has the configuration set up to go to the Cosmos DB, and it takes care of it for me. Does that make sense, this flow? And hopefully it'll make more sense when I show it to you. So what I'm going to use as my demo is a set of 3 functions that work together. The functions interact with 2 different collections in a Cosmos DB database. One of the collections is going to be all of, or some, I'm sure, a very small subset of your text, your cell phone numbers. I think that I know that word. And the other one is going to be a collection of messages I'm going to send, not text messages, but just data that I'm going to be sending into a different database that is keeping track of every time my dog gets another treat. We call them cookies in our house. So every time he gets another cookie. So that's one database, and the other database, actually they're collections in the same database. The other one is going to be cell phone numbers. So that's the data. So now I have 3 functions. The first one is a trigger, an HTTP trigger, where I'm just sending the HTTP request to the function just to say, he got another cookie, right? And then that gets stored. This function will hear that. It'll store it into the database. The second one is another HTTP trigger function, which is going to be for anybody who gives me your cell phone number. That's going to be another HTTP trigger, and the function will then tie it'll pass that along to an output binding that pushes it into the subscriber database. Okay? Then comes the fun one that puts it all together. The fun one is anytime I put another message into the dog cookie database that says he ate another cookie, then it's going to trigger, so now it's going to be listening to the Samson Eats collection. Every time there's a change in the Samson Eats collection, it's going to go to the other collection, read all of your cell phone numbers, and then the output is going to be an SMS, right? But I'm not writing the code for it reading your cell phone numbers. That's going to be an input binding, right? That's the second kind of a binding. It's got the triggers, the input to get other data sources. So that's what it's going to do. It's going to go out and get the other data source. So I guess first, let's hope that, okay. This is, that should say 9 digits. This is the URL if you want to do it, and I will erase all of this afterwards. It's just going into my own, my very own account on Cosmos DB. Don't bother putting the +46, so just put in 9 digits, and then it's going to go into my database. Sell it to somebody. Not with a 0 in front. Sorry, yeah. I have to learn this every time I travel to a new country because everybody's different. And then Germany, they don't even have one set length. It can be anywhere between 6 and 14 digits. I'm like, okay. All right, so this is really, really teeny tiny. So this is a problem with the portal. I'm in the portal. I'm in just the area for my my functions, and should be able to do that. Okay. The problem you'll see. I just want to point out over here when you're in the portal. See, I have this view files over here. It just lists the 2 files I can look at and put them in here, and it also has this ability to test over here. But in order to make this so I can actually see it, and you can actually see it, then I have to do that, and then I just scroll over and scroll down and everything. It's kind of annoying. So here's the function app, Data API Demo version 2. It's version 2 because we've just moved to the version 2 of the Azure Functions. Azure Functions, the version 1 only worked in Windows. Version 2 now is based on .NET Core. It's cross-platform. I get to do everything, even in coding and everything. I get to use my Mac. It's cross-platform, and actually there's a lot of improvements. We would like to hope, of course, that there are a lot of improvements to a version 2 over a version 1. But the biggest thing is that it is cross-platform, so you can code it cross-platform and test it and debug it and host it in Docker and do all kinds of things if you want. So you don't have to host it on the portal even. So there's been some demos I've seen like on MSDN blogs of deploying creating the functions and deploying them into Kubernetes so that you can really have a whole bunch to manage all of your many millions of users all at once. So this is the app itself, and the app has its app settings. Come on, I thought this was fast internet here. Seriously. Okay. So there's app settings here, which are just some basics. And then, wait, which one was I just in? Function app settings. Function app settings. Sorry, I think the naming is really confusing because I can't ever tell the difference between application settings and function app settings. So the important thing about the application settings is you can put all your secrets in here. They're even hidden. But I have things like my, don't take a picture of this. Like this is my account endpoint and keys for my Cosmos database. Right, so that's a secret. These are my IDs for my Twilio account, right, which will run out really quickly because it's just a little test account, so try not to use it for your business. I just mean my codes. Okay, so you can put all your secrets in here, and these are shared across the different function apps. So I have 3 function apps here. I would be more than happy to do this later, and if anybody wants to see kind of like going through the whole thing, we just don't have time to go through all of it. But these are the 3 different ones. Here's the one for subscribing. So this is the one where it's an HTTP request. And if I wanted to create one from the beginning, this is a nice thing about the portal. The portal has all these workflows kind of built in for you, so you can kind of walk through it. Right, so that's how I created all this stuff here. So when you're first learning, it's really nice to say, oh yeah, I want an HTTP trigger. I'm going to have function level authorization. And then you can start setting up your bindings. So that's just giving you some default code for an HTTP trigger. But if you go to integrate, then, and this looks a lot better when we're not zoomed out, then you can create various triggers. You can only have one trigger, I'm sorry. You can create various bindings. So this one doesn't have an input binding, but if I wanted to add an input binding, it has all these pre-create, right? These are the bindings that exist already, so it makes it really easy for me to set one up, right? And I can have multiple input bindings and bring in data from different data sources once this function is running. And then I can do the same thing with output bindings. I can have multiple output bindings, HTTP response. I can have output bindings too. So now we're on the possibilities here. Azure Queue Storage, Event Hubs, Excel table, Outlook. I know they sound kind of familiar to Microsoft. Twilio, that's not Microsoft, that's the SMS. Azure Cosmos DB. So there's a lot of ways you can say, here's what I'm packing up. Okay, I'm giving it to the output binding, and the configuration of the output binding does the rest of the work. So I'll get rid of this one, and I'll look at the subscribe one, and we can see a little bit about how this is set up. So this is an HTTP trigger, so there's really not much going on there. And it's set up some default, like here's the parameter names that are used in the code. And I've also set up an Azure Cosmos DB output. So I've named parameters. This is the name of the output document I'm going to create So in my code, I'm going to have a variable named output document. So the output binding knows to look for that. And here's my whole configuration, right? I'm just saying down here, I'm saying which account am I using, which Cosmos DB account am I using, what's the name of the database is here, and what's the name of the collection within the database. So it's all from configuration. And I liked learning using this form. I mean, it seems really like, oh, right? But for me, it was like it handheld me through what it was that I needed. But in the end, what it really does is it creates, sorry, gotta wait for these things to come up. It creates this function.json file. And there's the configuration. So this is what it's creating. So once I learned these and understood how these things all worked, and understood what how function JSON was structured and how I can have the different bindings. So there's 3 bindings in here, right? Here's an input binding. See, it says direction in. Not an input binding, I'm sorry. This is an HTTP trigger. That's the name. Like, you have to use that name. That's what Azure Functions understands. So what type is it? This one happens to be an HTTP trigger, right? And then there's another binding here. This is an output, and it's an HTTP output. There's another binding here. This one, the type of it is a Cosmos DB output. Its direction is out. And here's the configuration that I set up in the little form. The database name is data API demo node, right? The collection name is subscribers. The connection string setting, not the connection string, is this name here, and that's one of my secrets. So if you go back over to application settings, you'll see that Lerman conference _document DB equals, and it has that connection string with my account key and things like that, all the secrets. So that's really that's creating, like doing all that setup, creating all the bindings. But for me, going through that process of using those input screens and the forms and everything really helped me this first few times, just going through the process of setting it up. And then I was able to look at this and understood what this was all about. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to my computer screen. We do this all the time. Understand what this is, right? So, and let me just relate that to the function that is working here. So this is the subscribe function, right? This is just the configuration of it. Now I have to go over here. And because I'm using Node.js, it's expecting a file called index.js. So it's a little different. It's set up a little differently for when you're doing .NET and C#. So the most important thing in here is this context. We do everything through the context. So I was having some problems today. I was like, I just used this demo. Why isn't it working? So I was actually using the context has a log, right? So the log was outputting stuff. I'm like, why isn't this working? Okay, I got here. So remember debugging like this in 1988? Right? Just by putting messages and things. So this is still like pretty impressive to be able to do this right in the portal. But that's what all these context logs are, and that those come down here when I'm trying to debug this way. Thankfully, I'm not doing most of my development on the portal anymore. I'm doing it in VS Code. But what's more important is here is that, let's see, I'm reading the message that's coming in. Now our REQ, that's the variable name given for the request, that was set up in the HTTP trigger configuration. It said, look, I want my variable for the request named REQ. So there it is right in the code, so it understands. And then I'm just reading the message that came in through the request and doing some processing on it. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a little JSON doc, right? That's it. This is just another log here, so this is nothing. There's actually not very much code in here. If I deleted all my log information, there's like 1, 2, 3, like, I don't know, 10 lines of code here. But a lot of this was me just being a dum-dum and trying to debug and figure out what the heck was going on here, right? So like all those go away. So once I've created my little JSON doc, then I tell the context to go read the bindings and it know that there's a binding that has a variable called output document, right? Because I set that up in the configuration, so it's literally named output document. And I'm saying that output document is my little JSON doc that I just created, right? Now remember, I had two output bindings. One was out to Cosmos DB, and the other was a request. A response. And the response binding had a variable name of res. So, it could be foo, right? Just random. So this is the response I'm setting. And anybody who subscribed, did you see this response? Like, awesome, you're subscribed. Did anybody subscribe? Like 2 people? I just need one. Okay, I just need one person, because when we run this, then I just have proof. This was just another log, and then here's just a context response if there's an error. So really, all I did for sending that data into the database was I created my little JSON document and I set it. It's just these 2 lines of code right here. Set it to the binding. That's it. All the rest was handled with a configuration. So this notify on DB change, yeah, it's okay. This notify on DB change, this is the one that has a listener to the Cosmos DB. And we'll just look at the integrations for that one. So this one, this one has a Cosmos DB trigger, not an HTTP trigger, but it also has a Cosmos DB input. Okay, and then its output is this other binding, Twilio SMS. So rather than looking through all these, now that you're all experienced looking at the function.json, I'm just going to go to advanced editor, which really just opens up the function.json quickly for me. So here is teeny tiny text. I don't know. Whoa, wrong way. So you may all be able to see it. I'm the one who can't see it because I have terrible eyes. So here are all the bindings that are set up. Notice this one is Cosmos DB trigger, but this one is just Cosmos DB. And you can ignore the little squiggly lines, right? So that's the trigger. It's for something coming in. It's looking at that same connection string. It's looking at the same database, and it's watching the collection called Samson Eats. That's the one where I'm sending the message that said, the dog got another cookie. I think my dog would be really fat, but he's not. He's just spoiled, as they should be. So that's what that is. It's just a listener, but that's what the trigger is. It's a listener. So anytime something changes, so the listener is not as specific as, did something get added? Did something get edited? Did something get deleted? That's when, maybe that's when you start getting into your code to make those kinds of decisions. But I'm not being specific. I'm just like, something changed. So that's the trigger. Now here's the input binding. And the name of it is very specific, Cosmos DB, so I know that's not a trigger, it's just a binding. And it's is the input binding. And what it's going to do is it's going to read from the other collection, the one called subscribers, the one that we just got all of those text messages into. And it even uses the SQL API to just select the phone number from that, from the JSON docs. So that's what that's going to do. So it's all configured. I don't have to write all that code. And then the last one is a Twilio SMS, again, that's specifically named. That's going to use the Twilio SMS extension. And now I have some default to and from, but actually in the code will make that a little different. So, but these are the settings for using my account, and this is going to be an output binding. So if we look at the code, okay, here's what's coming in, right? We've got the context. The context is how we communicate with the function. Documents is the name I said, whatever's happened on the database where we're listening, right? The response to the listener. And then subscriber list. Oh, subscriber list, I'd have to go back and look at my configuration. Subscriber list is from the input binding. So it's doing that select using the SQL API against Cosmos DB on the subscriber database, and then that's what's coming in there. So that's coming in through the input binding. So the input binding, I'm not asking for it in my code. That's actually just coming in. As soon as it's triggered, before it comes to my code, it goes and gathers all of the data that's supposed to come in from the input binding. So all of it is ready and waiting for me, and then I can write some code. I just make sure, now documents is the one I'm listening to. It's just making sure it's not empty. And so something happened in that collection. I don't even care what it was. And now I'm going to read through all of the SMS, all the text phone numbers in the subscriber list, and I'm going to send out a message, right? But again, just really simple, because all the important stuff for making it happen, all the implementation detail, it's in the configuration. So I just had to work out all this really complicated code. So let's see. I'm going to go to add data to Cosmos DB. That's the one where I'm actually saying, okay, the dog ate a cookie. And I've got a little test over here just to make it happen. And I'll run the test. So it doesn't even matter what I'm putting in there. Oh, come on. Yeah, all this stuff is just freaking hidden. Okay, it doesn't resize itself. Believe me, Microsoft has heard about this from me. Okay, so I'm going to run this. I'm going to cross my fingers that I don't see any boo-boos, like red letters in the log. And then eventually some of you are going to go, yeah, I got it. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I got it. And two of the young women who are organizing the conference, they're going to be getting them too, but they won't run in here because they were helping me test it out earlier. Did anybody, you got it? Okay, so there's my proof. Did any money exchange hands here for you to do that? No. No, I didn't bribe you with any dog cookies. That's really what I do. That's how I bribe the dog. Okay, so now I want to just quickly flip over to Visual Studio Code, just because I want you to understand that is one option, right? Using the portal is one option for developing that. Again, for me, it was just really to get my head wrapped around it, my aha moments, but the experience of debugging, as you saw back 20-year-old, 30-year-old pattern of debugging just by spitting out some error messages was a little lame. So what I have here in Visual Studio Code, who uses VS Code? Woo, I love it. I love VS Code. So Visual Studio Code has these amazing Azure extensions. It's got one for managing your Azure account. It's got one for doing some work with functions. Helps you create functions and all the stuff you need in your functions right here in code. But you can also look and see what functions are up on your actually in the portal, running in the portal, and even some of their status, which it's important to see, because mine are all demos, and I hate having my demos keep running if I forget to shut them down and ticking away at my Azure expenses. And also there's another nice extension for Cosmos DB. So I can go in here and look at some of my databases in here, which is really it's really pretty amazing. So these are just some different ones. So the functions, the functions that are tied to Cosmos DB, whether it's the trigger or the input binding or an output binding, they do have an option to say, if it doesn't exist yet, go ahead and create it, and it'll create it with some defaults. So I'm not going to waste time waiting for that to happen. So mine already exist. So I have, those are my functions. I have let me just collapse some of these so it's easier to see. That one was just a test, it doesn't count. So there's notify subscribers on DB change. There's subscribe, right? These are the three different functions. And what you can do is you create a folder, and then the Azure function gives you this ability right here, right? This will say, I want to take an existing folder, and I want to build an Azure function app in there. So it will give you a local version of an app settings file, and it'll give you the basic, it'll pull in the packages and the extensions and things, and just put in the basics that you need to do the development. So it's pretty nice. This one here I'm not going to do all of them, so at least I can show you. This one will create a function, and it says what folder do you want it in, right? So I picked the folder that I already said this is going to be an Azure Function app, and you can put them in there. And it sets up all the stuff that you need for a function. So it will create your basic index.js file, just kind of a stake in the ground file, and it'll create, it actually will ask you what type of function it is. Is it a Cosmos DB trigger, HTTP trigger, etc. Right? So it actually has doesn't look like the portal, but it does just kind of walks through asking you the important questions to set up the basics. So it starts out with the right setup. So I've got these three in here. So notice, here's my add data to Cosmos DB. All I have in here is a function.json, which looks just like the one I had. As a matter of fact, you can download, if I started something on the portal, you can actually download all that code and open it up here. The only thing it won't download is the application settings, all those secrets. Or maybe now it does, I can't remember. You can also, having created an app function or a function app here, you can upload it and create it. Now, but what it does when it uploads it, it zips it up and it uploads it like as a package. So you can't upload it and then edit it in the portal and then download it and edit it in Visual Studio Code. So you're just going to go in one direction. But anytime you make a change to these, you would upload it again, and it's just going to overwrite whatever was up there, right, and just push a whole new version up there for you. So this is exactly the same code as what was in the portal app that I was showing you, but it's just the same setup. Here's index.js for adding data to the Cosmos DB. Here is the notify subscribers on DB change. So this has more bindings in it, right, because I got the Twilio bindings. One of the things that you do need to do when you're developing here is, if you're using the bindings, the APIs behind the bindings are extensions, so you will have to install those extensions, but it will prompt you. Azure Functions will prompt you to do that. So there's this, again, the same code for messaging all the subscribers. And this is, and there's the subscribe one. So huge difference between here and there is not only can I run it here, but I can also debug it. So I'm going to just start by running this function app so you can see what that looks like, and I'll just do it from the CLI. So I'm just going to say func start. So Azure Functions, the API, it has a whole command line interface that you can use. So I'm just going to say func start. So this is like .NET Run, right? And as a matter of fact, .NET Core is inside of here, so it's kind of calling .NET Run. Pushes out a whole lot of information. We probably already went by the beautiful Azure logo. And then when it's all done, hopefully it doesn't have any error messages, and then it just lets you know these three functions are ready and waiting on my local host, like 7071, to subscribe. So the three are running there. And then I can go over to, let's see, I'll go over to Postman and test it out. So I've got a few notify subscribers. So I've actually, this is a separate database, so you won't get your notifications, I'm really sorry, but I will. So here's the one to add data to Cosmos DB. This is the one, the dog just got another cookie, right? So that's going to push it in there. Then I've got this other thing listening, and then I've got the Twilio thing. So I'll just cross my fingers. It's sending. Remember, I'm not debugging yet. I'm just hoping it happens. And then there you can see that message just came to my cell phone, right? So they all just work together. But what's really nice about being able to do this, I'm going to Control C to stop it all, is that I can debug in here. So, you know, you have the full, rich debugging experience for developing. So I've got all of the tools that I need right at my hands in Visual Studio Code with the extensions, right? And all of the things that Visual Studio Code gives me, plus the addition of these nice extensions for building the Azure functions, and I can do the testing. So, okay, so those are ready again, but this time I'm debugging, and I'll just run this one again. And there, it just, you know, it just broke. So I don't mean broke, I mean it hit the break point because it's not broke. So I can, just now take advantage of all the tools within Visual Studio Code and look at variables and see what's going on in there. So, and that was my journey, right, for learning Azure Functions. Of course, I loved having the excuse of playing with Cosmos DB too, because it's cool. And Cosmos DB is not really something you're going to use if you only have 5 records, right? The whole point of that is, that's for big data. But I've been using it to understand how things work. So when I'm doing that, I'm not doing performance testing and load balancing and all that. I just want to understand how the pieces, the puzzle pieces to go together. So this gives me, once I had that understanding, oh, I got my message again. Once I had that understanding of how things work, thanks to playing around with a portal, then I was able to take all of that, I understand these function.json files. I understand the bindings. I understand the difference between the triggers bindings and the input bindings and the output bindings, and interacting with that context when I'm in my code. So then I was able to just, now I can just write Azure functions and I can deploy them. By the way, that functions also let you deploy. This is here, and it double checks when you do it, like, are you sure you're going to be overwriting it? And then when you go up, if you go to open it in the portal will say, this is you can't edit files here. You can look at them, but it's coming from a package. It's all packaged up. You can't edit. So once you've made that commitment, you're doing it here, then you're going to do it from code, which is what we like to do anyway, right? Like, I want to code the portal. Again, beautiful experience for me to get my head around it and understand. So that was what I wanted to show you. This was just a little difference between the version 1 and the version 2. So I'll always be using version 2, and because it's cross-platform, but also gives me the ability to, I won't be dependent on hosting my functions in the Azure portal if I don't want to. I can host them in Docker because it'll just bring everything in that it wants, and then because I can host it in a container, I can also go to Kubernetes and really have a lot of distribution of the processes and everything. So I really, really love Azure Functions, and I hope you will too. And that's my story. Here's some resources. I have the code for this up on GitHub if you want to see it. And the teams, both the Cosmos DB and the Azure Functions teams, are very, very active on GitHub. So if you're using like the extensions or something like that, they're really responsive, which I'm happy about because I always break things right before I have to do demos. So they're like, yes, we're here, we'll help you. Anyway, so thank you very much, and have a great afternoon. And if you are doing anything, if you've never, has anybody here ever used Azure Functions before? That's cool. So it's also cool because now there's a whole bunch of new people, and I hope that you'll also be digging into them and excited to learn them. Thanks so much.